The Red Sea, through which more than 12% of global trade passes, has turned into a war zone. U.S. aircraft carriers are striking the Yemeni shores, while the Houthis respond with rocket salvos and drone attacks. Commercial ships are changing routes, oil prices are rising, and the global economy is reeling from the consequences. Just a few months ago, few could have imagined that a rebel group from one of the world's poorest countries would dare to challenge the American fleet. And not only stand their ground, but also force the Pentagon to deploy new forces to the region. How did the Houthis, who were recently considered a tribal militia, become a threat to a superpower? Why can't Washington, which once defeated Iraq, suppress them in weeks despite hundreds of missile strikes? This is a story about how cheat drones are defeating billion-dollar destroyers, and how a handful of fanatical fighters are keeping entire trade regions in fear, and why Yemen, which many considered a secondary war, suddenly became the key to global security. Complex Yemen is a country where one of the oldest civilizations on the planet originated. Even in biblical times, the Sabaean kingdom flourished here, led by the Queen of Sheba, one of the wisest women in history. The majestic ruins of Marib and ancient inscriptions on stones testify to a highly developed culture that existed in these lands long before the emergence of many modern states. However, today Yemen is more associated not with its great past, but with endless war, devastation, and the largest humanitarian crisis of our time. This land has never been a single monolithic entity. Geographical fragmentation, the tribal structure of society, and religious differences have shaped a complex mosaic of Yemeni statehood over the centuries. The mountainous regions of the north have historically developed separately from the southern territories. Even in ancient times, there were independent kingdoms here: Saba, Kataban, Hadramaut, Man, each with its own culture and traditions. The medieval period solidified this division. While the north was under the rule of the Zaydi Imams, the south experienced a succession of dynasties influenced by Egypt or the Ottoman Empire. During the colonial period, the north of the country maintained relative independence under local rulers, while the south came under British control. Aden, transformed into a major port on the route to India, became a gateway for the introduction of European ideas and technologies. This difference in historical development created two completely different societies within one region. After liberation from colonial dependence in the mid-20th century, both parts of Yemen took different paths. The north developed as a traditional monarchy, then a republic, where strong influence of tribal structures and Zaydi Islam was maintained. The south, after a prolonged guerrilla war, chose a socialist path of development, creating the only Marxist state in the Arab world. The unification in the 1990s was largely an extremely forced measure. The collapse of the Soviet Union deprived South Yemen of economic support, while the northerners sought access to the strategically important southern ports. However, the artificiality of this merger became apparent almost immediately. Different legal systems, economic models, and even concepts of national identity made integration extremely difficult. The deep-rooted causes of the modern conflict lie precisely in this historical legacy. The differences between the North and the South were not erased by unification, but were only exacerbated by economic inequality and political contradictions. The founder, when in the early 2000s, a little-known preacher, Hussein al-Houthi, began gathering his first followers in remote mountain villages of northern Yemen, no one could have imagined that 2 decades later, this modest movement would transform into a formidable force capable of dictating terms to the wealthiest monarchies of the Persian Gulf. Today, the Houthis are constantly in the headlines of global media. They control the capital of Yemen, possess a missile arsenal threatening international shipping, and successfully stand against the region's most powerful military coalition. How did they manage this? The answer lies in an astonishing combination of religious fanaticism, military cunning, and an unprecedented ability to survive in the most incredible conditions. Hussein al-Houthi, the charismatic founder of the movement, was born into a family of hereditary Zaydi theologians from the Sada province. His father was among the most respected interpreters of Zaydi teachings, a unique branch of Shia Islam that has defined the spiritual life of the mountainous regions of northern Yemen for over 12 centuries. The childhood and youth of the future leader were spent in an atmosphere of deep piety and traditional Muslim education. From the age of 6, he began studying the Holy Quran under his father's guidance, showing extraordinary abilities in memorizing and interpreting the sacred texts. By the age of 10, the boy already knew most of the Quran by heart, and by 15, he had mastered the basics of Zaydi jurisprudence and Arabic philology. In the 1980s, al-Houthi visited the religious centers of Sana'a, where he became acquainted with Salafism. This became a turning point in his worldview. From a traditional Muslim, he turned into a fierce critic of the existing order. He was outraged by how Salafi preachers undermined Zaidi traditions. By the mid-1990s, al-Houthi had gathered like-minded individuals around him. His sermons attracted more and more followers, especially from the northern provinces. He was particularly skilled at combining religious rhetoric with sharp social criticism, linking theological discussions to the real problems of Yemenis: unemployment, corruption, lack of education, and healthcare. Gradually, al-Houthi formed a clear ideological platform that included three main principles: resistance to Salafist expansion, opposition to American influence in the region, and rejection of Saleh's corrupt regime. It was during this period that the authorities first took serious notice of the activities of the charismatic preacher, whose influence extended far beyond the purely religious sphere. Initially, the authorities underestimated the scale of the threat. Al-Houthi's early activities were somewhat tentative. He was prohibited from speaking in major mosques and was denied permits to hold mass events. However, this only increased his popularity. His sermons began to be passed on by word of mouth, recorded on tapes, and secretly distributed throughout the northern part of the country. The turning point came in the spring of 2004, when the government announced the start of a large-scale operation against religious extremists in Sada. Al-Houthi was declared wanted, and his supporters began to be detained. Al-Houthi spent the last months of his life constantly moving between mountain villages. He truly dedicated his entire life to the development of the Houthi movement. But paradoxically, he did much more to unite the people with his death. The death of Hussein al-Houthi as a result of a clash with government forces became a turning point in the history of the emerging movement. From a sect to a state, the leader's death left the Houthis in a state of profound shock. In those September days of 2004, when the mournful news spread through the mountain villages of the Sada province, many believed that the movement, under the pressure of government forces, was doomed to swift oblivion. However, at this critical moment, the younger brother of the deceased leader, Abdul Malik al-Houthi, did something incredible. In just a few weeks, he not only gathered the scattered groups of supporters but also established a fundamentally new management system that proved to be much more effective than the previous charismatic but unstructured organization. The first 6 months after the leadership change became a time of remarkable metamorphosis, as the movement was literally reborn from within. Abdul Malik, although he did not possess his brother's oratory talent, was distinguished by an analytical mind and considerable administrative abilities. He conducted a large-scale reorganization, transforming the spontaneous uprising into a well-structured military-political machine. The Sada province was divided into 7 districts, each with its own clear management structure. It was during this period that the famous organizational talent of the Houthis first emerged, their remarkable ability to create parallel systems of power, completely independent of state institutions. In each region, councils of elders were established, which became the centers of local self-government. Their composition included not only religious figures but also teachers, doctors, and former officials. Special attention was given to youth committees, where talented young men from poor mountain families could quickly rise to leadership positions. These cells integrated so seamlessly into local communities that government forces could not distinguish peasants from resistance members. In remote mountain areas, dozens of field training centers were organized, where commanders trained recruits in mountain warfare tactics. It was during this period that the foundations of that remarkable combat capability were laid, which would later allow them to withstand the superior forces of the international coalition. Internal struggle. In early 2008, the Houthis conducted their first large-scale operation outside their traditional zone of influence. Particularly impressive was their first use of ballistic missiles. The launches of homemade Qassam rockets at government targets caused a real shock in the capital. Although the accuracy of these strikes left much to be desired, their psychological effect was colossal. This made many Yemenis ponder the real strength of the rebel movement. An important aspect of the expansion was establishing control over key transportation routes. The Houthis blocked 3 out of 5 main roads connecting the northern provinces to the capital. The culmination of this period was a new stage of the conflict, when the Yemeni government threw almost all available forces against the Houthis. Over time, as the Houthis gained confidence, their ambitions grew. They began to position themselves as a national liberation movement, fighting for the rights of all Yemenis. Simultaneously, in other Islamic regions, the Arab Spring unfolded. The Houthi leaders closely followed the developments in Tunisia and Egypt, preparing to use the new political crisis for a decisive push for power. Under President Saleh's leadership, Yemen faced deep social problems, poverty, corruption, and a lack of control over the northern provinces. When the Arab Spring began, thousands of people expressed dissatisfaction with his rule and demanded his resignation. As a result of the shelling of the mosque and the presidential residence, Saleh, the prime minister, and 7 bodyguards were injured. After receiving treatment in Saudi Arabia, Saleh transferred power to Vice President Abd Rabbu Mansur Hadi, which ended one of the longest reigns in the Arab world. When the waves of the Arab Spring protests reached Yemen in early 2011, the Houthis emerged as the only organized force in the country ready for a drastic change in the political landscape. While the attention of the global media was focused on the bloody crackdowns on protesters in the capital, the Houthis methodically strengthened their positions in the north and made a rapid push to the south. Many cities surrendered almost without a fight, as local elites, disillusioned with the central government, saw the Houthis as a lesser threat than the growing chaos. In the spring of 2014, the Houthis began their advance on Sana'a. They blockaded army garrisons and occupied government buildings. President Hadi was forced to flee to the south of the country. The capture of Sana'a became a turning point in the history of Yemen and the entire region. The Houthis, who started as a religious group, now controlled the capital and a large part of the state apparatus. Their success caused alarm in neighboring countries, especially in Riyadh, where there were fears of possible Iranian influence in the south of the Arabian Peninsula. Storm of resolve. After the capture of Sana'a, the Houthis unexpectedly for many transformed from local insurgents into a key player on the geopolitical map of the Middle East. Their rapid rise did not go unnoticed in Washington, where they gradually began to realize that the Yemeni crisis could disrupt the balance of power in a strategically important region. In the spring of 2015, when the Saudi coalition launched Operation Storm of Resolve, the US initially took a position of cautious support for their Arabian allies. The American military provided intelligence, conducted aerial refueling, and even discussed possible deliveries of precision-guided weapons. However, as the conflict dragged on, Washington began to express increasing concern about the growing influence of the Houthis and their alleged ties with Iran. The first months of the conflict indeed unfolded according to a classic scenario. Elite Saudi units, equipped with the latest technology, with the support of aviation, began a methodical offensive. However, the war, which according to all forecasts was supposed to end in a few months, turned into one of the bloodiest and most destructive conflicts in the region. Gradually, the Houthis deployed an entire arsenal of ballistic missiles, including models with a range of up to 1,000 kilometers. These strikes on Saudi Arabia, especially on the kingdom's oil infrastructure, became a turning point in the conflict. For the first time in its history, the wealthiest country in the region faced a direct military threat to its key economic asset. Saudi Arabia, having spent tens of billions of dollars and lost hundreds of soldiers, found itself unable to achieve a decisive advantage. Crisis in the Red Sea. But how to explain that the small number of Yemenis can successfully resist the technologically advanced naval forces of the USA? How the warm waters of the Red Sea, which for centuries served as a bridge between the East and the West, have turned into the arena of one of the most unusual military conflicts of modern times. 2. Understand the reasons for this conflict. We need to delve into the history of one of its sides. Hardened by prolonged resistance and repeated victories over superior forces, the Houthis have justifiably become serious opponents even for the American military machine. After the Houthis firmly established themselves on the western coast of Yemen, they began to control strategically important ports, thereby gaining the ability to influence shipping. In the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, a narrow bottleneck through which about 12% of global trade passes, the first alarming signals were heard after the start of the military conflict in the Gaza Strip. Supporting Palestine, the Houthis announced a naval blockade of Israel, but soon their main target became American warships. Military experts were astonished when the Houthis demonstrated an arsenal that significantly exceeded the boldest predictions. Among their developments were cruise missiles with a range of up to 500 kilometers, combat drones capable of covering 1,500 kilometers, underwater kamikaze drones, and complex systems of electronic warfare. These technologies, developed under strict blockade conditions, demonstrate the movement's remarkable ability to adapt modern military developments to the conditions of asymmetric warfare. The escalation of the conflict evolved increasingly. In mid-November 2023, the Houthis carried out a daring capture of a civilian vessel owned by Israeli businessman Abraham under by early December there. Missiles threatened an American destroyer for the first time, and by the end of the month, a large international container ship was attacked. The culmination was the January attack of 2024, when simultaneously more than 20 drones and missiles were launched. The Houthis used dozens of cheap drones and more advanced missiles, creating constant psychological pressure on the enemy. At the same time, they skillfully used civilian ships as cover, placing the US Navy in a difficult moral choice. The American response has not yet yielded the expected results. The economics of this confrontation are not in favor of the superpower. Intercepting a single missile costs millions of dollars, while the drones themselves cost the rebels thousands. Such an imbalance in cost makes prolonged confrontation extremely expensive for the US and its allies. Paradoxically, it is in this conflict that the Houthis demonstrate an astonishing ability to turn military confrontation into political capital. Within Yemen, they use the crisis to consolidate power, presenting themselves as the only force capable of challenging American imperialism. At the same time, they develop shadow maritime trade schemes, bypassing sanctions and gaining significant revenues from illegal supplies. Analysts warn that a prolonged conflict could trigger a global economic shock, spark a new wave of energy crisis, and create a dangerous precedent for other non-state actors around the world. What's next? The economic consequences of the crisis have already extended far beyond the region. According to the International Monetary Fund, the increase in logistics chain costs has added almost a full percentage point to global inflation, which has become a serious blow to the already fragile world economy. Insurance. Companies now demand 10 times more for passage through the Red Sea than just a year ago. Many shipowners prefer to spend weeks circumnavigating Africa rather than risk their ships and cargo. The diplomatic front looks no less alarming. The latest attempt at resolution failed spectacularly when the Houthis put forward demands that even their regional patrons considered excessive. Military experts are at a loss. Classic crisis resolution scenarios appear increasingly less realistic. A full-scale ground operation in Yemen, which was talked about as a last resort just a year ago, is now seen as a sure path to a bloody Afghan-style deadlock. An international naval blockade may prove to be economically unviable in the face of the ingenuity of the Houthis and their growing arsenal. Even the optimistic scenario of gradual de-escalation seems increasingly elusive against the backdrop of daily reports of new attacks and countermeasures. As noted by Middle Eastern veterans of politics, the current crisis is unique in that, for the first time in modern history, a non-state actor has successfully challenged the maritime dominance of the West. The Houthis, who started with primitive boats and homemade rockets, today demonstrate an astonishing ability to learn, adapt, and implement the most advanced technologies of asymmetric warfare. Their success has already become an inspiring example for dozens of movements around the world, dreaming of replicating this Yemeni experiment. Now, in the middle of 2024, it becomes clear that the Red Sea has become a theater not just of military actions, but of a global redistribution of influence. Every day of this crisis changes the balance of power, undermines old alliances, and creates new unexpected alliances. How far will this transformation go, and what kind of world will emerge from this chaos? It's a question that no analyst can answer today. But one thing is clear: the rules of the game have changed forever, and the world will never be the same again.